Justice, the people's champion, champion, champion. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, the people demand. Right to life and security. Oh, what a job. Oh, what a
Welcome to Let's Talk Justice. It is Monday. It is 1 p.m. I am Jade Williams. I am the Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Jamaican for Justice.
And I'm Michael Jackson, Executive Director of JFJ.
Michael, I'm surprised you were able to say that just now. Listener, she is still struggling with her voice. But so please hold some space for her as we go through the show today.
I hope I'm not too hard on the ears at all. But, it's exciting for us today. I did promise last week, Jade, in your absence, forgive me, that the next couple weeks, as best as we can, we're going to be talking some electoral reform matters.
I see.
Because as we're nearing the political season, we're in the political season, as we're nearing a general election, we know that we made our own recommendations to the Constitutional Reform Committee and the Joint Select Committee reviewing the Republic Bill around some areas for electoral reform, whether or not we vote directly for our Prime Minister, whether or not we should be voting directly for our senators. And we saw 2 Senate appointments in recent times, whether or not, for example, there should be a cap on the number of ministers that we have by virtue of our Constitution only giving a flooring. You can't have less than a particular amount, but it doesn't say what the maximum is. So these are some things I felt it important for us to talk about. And we're starting today with a particular topic that is quite topical, which is how we finance campaigns and what are some of the reforms that we're looking at. Yeah.
All right. Yes. So we will have a brief interview with Dr. Barnett on the topic, and we will also later be joined by Professor Trevor Monroe to speak to campaign financing. But before we get into the topic, I think I can just give a little bit of an update on the Mario Dean matter.
Yeah, kudos to you and the others
Yes.
traversing Westmoreland.
It's been a journey. So I would have been gone for the past 2 Mondays observing the matter. But it is pleasing to see at least the progression going on. After spending years of the team traveling just to hear a postponement and adjournment, it's good that there is trial happening.
Yeah. For purposes of our listeners, Jade, we can't insert our opinions too much because the trial is underway and we have to be careful. But if you could just give a quick overview of what has happened since the trial has begun down by the Westmoreland Circuit Court, just some key things so the listeners are aware of, how many witnesses have taken the stand so far and so on.
Well, we're currently in the stage where the prosecution is leading their evidence, and they have called so far 3 witnesses. They have called Mercia Fraser, who is Mario's mother, as we know. They would have also called DSP Francis, and they have called Corporal Williams as well. So far, those people have taken the stand. Unfortunately, DSP Francis has not finished giving his evidence as yet. He is ill, and there have been some challenges with his managing of his illness. So he's on sick leave, and the prosecution would have called Corporal Williams in his absence for him to start giving his evidence. So he did start giving his evidence, and now we are at cross-examination. There are 2 attorneys on the matter, so all witnesses will likely be cross-examined twice. So that cross-examination will continue tomorrow at 10 a.m.
Because it's 3 defendants, 1 attorney is defending 2.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So great. Thank you so much for that. What is on my mind as you gave that overview, Jade, which perhaps will segue into today's topic, we heard from the former political ombudsman, Donna Parchment Brown, expressing her concerns about the government's decision. If you remember, last year it was, or the year before, wherein the government took the decision to subsume the Office of the Political Ombudsman with the Electoral Commission of Jamaica. And there are some concerns that still remain with that decision, wherein whether or not the ECJ is in the position to fulsomely address all of the complaints that may come before it. What type of public statement is important, just to get a sense that we're having the ombudsman role fulsomely being carried out, wherein any misconduct of our political leaders, those who are vying as candidates, would be accurately and adequately addressed. Those concerns still remain. There are still some legislative confusion that exists regarding how the ECJ would be able to fully assume those roles. What exactly is the procedure for the ECJ to, adjudicate on matters, if you will? And we heard from the former political ombudsman saying some of these same concerns that have been said by JFJ, said by NIA, said by CAFE, and others. And I think it's important that the government revisits that particular decision, because at this time, when we're in an election season, you're nearing a general election, you want to ensure that you have an umpire in this game that can fulsomely carry out the duties. And I don't think you can starve an institution of powers, the teeth to get its work done, and, that legislative strength, and then say, oh, they weren't as effective as before. So I think we have to be looking at what the role of the political ombudsman was intended to do, and whether or not the ECJ can fulsomely execute those duties. And we have heard, for example, from Errol Miller, who has also weighed in, I think last year it was, to say no, bad decision, and it should be reversed. And that's something that JFJ is also reiterating, the importance of reversing that particular decision.
All right, thank you for that, Mikhail. I think we can go into our did you know and trivia question for this week.
Yes.
All right, so our did you know is again related to the topic as it usually is, but we're speaking to the declarations that parties and candidates are to make to the ECJ. Remember, we're talking about campaign financing this week. So the political parties and the candidates must declare to the ECJ all contributions of $250,000 or more, and legal entities and natural persons can contribute up to $1.5 million per candidate or $31.5 million per registered political party. And when we spoke to Dr. Barnett earlier, one of the things he spoke about was this $250,000 and whether or not that threshold there made sense in our context here in Jamaica.
Yes. All right. So to kickstart this important discussion.
Right before we kickstart it, our trivia question for today.
Your giveaways.
Yes, totally forgot. In what year did the Representation of the People Amendment Act take effect? So in what year did the Representation of the People Amendment Act take effect? So you can send that answer to 2397583 to our WhatsApp, or you can respond on our IG, JA4Justice, or Twitter.
All right, Jade, we have a very well done script by our digital media officer, but we won't be able to read everything because I think it's important that we allow the guests to really speak on some of the gaps. But just to note that we have our campaign financing laws in Jamaica, some of which are, in terms of the role of the ECJ, it's spelled out in the ROPA, the Representation of the People Amendment Act of 2016. That would indicate the role of the ECJ in the monitoring of campaign finances and the time period within which these, donations can be made, the reporting requirements of both candidates and political parties. You named two of the financing overview in terms of declarations that must be made, as well as the limits that individuals or entities can actually provide to both a candidate as well as a registered political party. But we know that there are several gaps, and we want to get into that. For example, there is a 54-month period following the last general election that the campaign finance can commence for the upcoming general election, which is why recently you heard, for example, the ECJ coming out and say, hey, you can start accepting funds. So the commencement period for that is 54 months from the commencement of the current life of Parliament when the last general election was held. So we know that the season is open. The question is that we must ask ourselves, we know that we have a local government election that was held just recently. The question is, if I give you money during that period of time, do I still have to declare it? So that is a gap, and we know we have other loopholes. So we're going to be joined by Professor Trevor Monroe.
Yes, but we do have, I think we should take before that Dr. Barnett's comments. I don't think we have the time before the break to take it, though.
But before we go, were there any other major gaps that jumped out for you?
You know, for me, I think one of the things I've seen in other jurisdictions that I've always been interested in seeing here is who makes the donations. I know in other jurisdictions, like in the States, for example, when you go onto the Democratic Party's website, you'll see a list of...
No matter the amount.
Right. Individuals as well as companies, the amount that they gave, if they gave multiple times, you know, so it's a very detailed breakdown. And I think what that helps is to understand how sometimes markets might influence political motivation. And then that helps us as advocates to be able to better understand what we need to be addressing. So I think having that information is something that is a gap that I think we should address here.
Yes, not only us as advocates, but every citizen of Jamaica.
Yeah.
So this is a bigger issue of democratic participation, vertical accountability. But yeah, we take the break and then we pick up with the discussion. And we're also already joined by Professor Manuel, but we take the break.
All right.
Revamp your space with unique living, sleek fixed and sliding shower panels, shower systems and faucets, stylish vanities, LED and non-LED mirrors, basins and kitchen sinks, closet and storage solutions, hanging aids, and more. Available in different finishes and sizes to match your style. Transform your space and visit us today at shop number 6, 30 Dunrobin Avenue, Kingston 10. Call us at 876-755-3661 or visit our website at uniquelivingja.com to shop.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We are discussing campaign financing and finance reform in Jamaica. We are currently joined by Professor Trevor Monroe, and we will be hearing from Dr. Barnett throughout the show. Professor Monroe, are you with us?
Hi, good morning. How are you?
Well, good afternoon.
I think we're in the afternoon now.
Yes, we're in the afternoon now. So I think I'll ask you to just briefly for us, what are some of the gaps that you would have identified in our campaign financing framework?
If I may put it in context, however, so that we are clear that we've traveled some distance on the road, even though we have a far distance left to cover. This journey began in 2002 and more or less reached a milestone in 2018 when the regulations were passed which allowed the 2020 general election to be the first in Jamaica's history with some degree of campaign finance regulations. The 2002 was the time I moved a resolution in Jamaica Senate. I was in the Senate then, that we should have a comprehensive system of campaign financing and political party funding regulation. Then there were a number of developments thereafter. One was in 2003, I think it was. Then leader of the opposition, Seago, indicated that tainted money had entered into the GLP's internal elections. Then in 2006, the very same year in which I moved another resolution in the Senate indicating that the time was coming when we did need to have the fulsome regulations. 2006, two things happened. One was the Trafigura affair, where it was discovered that a Dutch oil drilling firm had contract with Jamaica and made contributions indirectly to the People's National Party. At the same time, but only discovered years after, for the 2007 general election, an illegal entity, the Olint, the money lending operation headed by David Smith, contributed $5 million to the Jamaica Labour Party and $2 million to the People's National Party for that election. And as you know, this became only disclosed during Smith's trial in Turks and Caicos, where he was convicted and has to be serving time. So I mention these two because despite the significant gaps to which you referred earlier on and which we shall discuss, these are two aspects which the current regime in Jamaica relating to campaign finance and political party funding, these are two mischiefs that were intended to be cured. In that under the current regulations, no entity that is having a contract with the government can do so without declaring it if the contract was signed 2 years before or even 2 years after the election. Secondly, no entity that is not legal, that is properly registered, can give money legally. It's an impermissible donor. So, in a sense, despite the limitations, we should bear in mind that we have traveled some distance to the extent that Jamaica remains the only country, the first and only country in the Caribbean with a comprehensive set of regulatory measures dealing with the matter of campaign financing in the way that we have. In fact, as we speak, in Dominica, in the last few months, there has been a considerable effort to introduce the first step in the process, which is the Jamaican model, with considerable resistance, and that remains a matter that the Dominican Parliament has yet to pass. So I say this in order to say that we have to review as well as seek to strengthen our campaign finance regulations against the background of this being a very challenging endeavor and one that requires great public information as well as citizen participation to get us where we need to be. We should mention as well that just a few weeks ago, in fact, Transparency International, in reviewing the 70 countries which had elections in 2024, indicated in their conclusion that campaign finance has remained the weakest area of electoral integrity. Quotes unquote, we have seen the sadly familiar faces of political corruption, undue corporate and donor influence, opaque donations, pay-to-play situations, and abuse of state resources. All of this despite the fact that the 2003 United Nations Convention Against Corruption, to which Jamaica has ratified, does require that there be transparency in the funding of candidates and political parties. But this remains a considerable area of dissatisfaction across democracies in different parts of the world. So I thought I should put it in context so that we don't get the sense that we're beating ourselves over the head. The campaign finance regulations that we have are a waste of time. Not so. It's some distance we have traveled, but we need to go considerably further, particularly in the area of disclosure.
Thank you for that context, Professor Monroe.
Thank you so much, Prof. Mikkel here. Just to ask two pointed questions based on the overview that you were giving. In a situation like Olint, for example, what obligation is there for political parties if they are aware of any company or individual who may have earned their funds in a way that is not in keeping with the law, to disclose that they got those funds from ill-gotten means, for example?
Well, first of all, they have an obligation once they discover this to return the funds within a specific period of time, because what it would mean is that they're receiving funding from what is described as an impermissible donor under the law. And if they don't return the funds within a specified period of time, which I don't have at the tip of my tongue, then they are guilty of an offense with appropriate charges on conviction.
Okay.
But they do have that obligation, which raises a broader question, Mikhail, that part of the gap that we have is in relation to the infrastructure which should accompany, the framework that should accompany even the limited regulatory regulations that we have. And in that context, I think that the ECJ, if it has not done so in the past and certainly should consider in the present, needs to develop an MOU with those bodies that have the responsibility of detecting tainted funds. I'm thinking, of course, of MOCA,
FID,
the FID,
yes.
Integrity Commission, the Financial Services Commission, a comprehensive memorandum of understanding which would allow the ECJ to better fulfill the functions of ensuring that tainted funds of one sort or another do not enter into the political and electoral stream.
Thank you so much, Prof. And another question, when you mentioned the Trafigura affair, which was a big issue in the 2000s, are there any gaps that still remain in terms of how we receive funds from foreign agencies or any foreign entities?
Well, there is, as you know, a ban on anonymous donations of any kind, so that if funds were received from a foreign entity or a local entity which was anonymous, then it needs to be declared. And the form that has to be completed is extremely detailed in terms of what needs to be disclosed. And of course, there is a prohibition on contributions from foreign governments, and that as well. Now, what is unclear in my mind as we speak, and it needs to be perhaps clarified by somebody like Dr. Barnett or the ECJ itself, is whether contributions from foreign companies are prohibited. Of course, whether they're foreign or local, they would have to be declared fully in the returns to the Electoral Commission. But I'm not sure whether a foreign entity such as Trafigura is and was would be prohibited as distinct from only required to make a fulsome report of their contribution as a company that has a contract with the government of Jamaica.
Yes, the reason I asked was because that is also my understanding. So I think that specific clarification would be needed, Prof.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. But I do wish to emphasize that there's a continuing global debate which hasn't been resolved decisively one way or the other between the requirements of transparency, the need for the electorate in a democracy to be fully informed regarding those issues that could impact whether how far their political representatives or the political party in office or the leadership of the country is actually serving the interest of minority groups or big funders on the one hand, and how to balance that with the sense that there should be a level of privacy in relation to people's ability to contribute. in many countries, the donations are not disclosed. In some they are. As you know, I think your earlier conversation mentioned the United States and the United Kingdom, where throughout around the year, around the clock, the donations to political parties are registered and declared. And for electoral purposes, over a certain amount is also having to be declared once it's contributed. But it's not many countries, I believe Canada may be one, where all the donations regardless of the size, would need to be actually registered and disclosed, because there's that continuing debate. A great dissatisfaction in Europe right now, in not only our 6 or 7 of the 27 countries in the EU have fulsome disclosure requirements, which is causing some concern as to how parties which are of extreme right or neo-fascist are getting the level of funding to perform as well as they do in recent elections. So this is a big issue that needs to be discussed in Jamaica more fulsomely, because we need to tip our balance more in favor of disclosure. In fact, looking back, I recall it was in 2011 or 2012 that the then president of the private sector organization, William Mahfoud, actually indicated that he was in favor of full disclosure of donations. And similarly, and this I found interesting on reflecting on our conversation today, that at the launch of the National Integrity Action in 2011, the guest speaker was then Prime Minister. It took over from Bruce Golding. Then Prime Minister, now Prime Minister, Andrew Holness. And the GIS report actually tells us that the Prime Minister was in favor of full disclosure so long as it could be compensated for by public funding of political parties, because he anticipated, and with some justification, that full disclosure would mean that the parties would lose an element of funding that would have to be made up.
And that is balanced, though, from what I understand, that you can get up to, what, 40%?
Yes,
of your expenses
on the campaign, from the campaign fund at the present time.
We have to take the break, Prof, but I ask that you stay with us, because I want us to discuss a gap. Because if person A would want to go below the threshold of the 250 and so on, then you just splinter your money across to some other individuals to donate, and then the political parties and the individuals would not have to then declare. So there are some loopholes with not having the full disclosure. But I want to pick up your thought, and then we hear from Dr. Barnett, who we had a pre-recording with. So let's take the break, Prof.
At the Jamaica Customs Agency, we care for our employees, customers, stakeholders, citizens, and our country. Customs cares. The temperature by the Jamaica Customs Agency is
29 degrees Celsius in Kingston as well as Montego Bay.
Coveside Concert Series presents Timeless. It happens on March 29 at Plantation Cove, St. Anne, featuring international superstar Dionne Warwick and more stars: Myrna Hague, Queen Marcia Griffiths, and Dwayne Stevens. Timeless, March 29. Showtime is 8 p.m. and tickets are now available at Fesco, Fontana Pharmacy, Plantation Smokehouse, and online at coveside.aitix.com.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. We're discussing the matter of financing politics, the campaign finance reform, the status of that, the loopholes that we have, and we're joined by Professor Trevor Monroe, founding director of the National Integrity Action. Prof, before the break, I was asking you about a loophole in my estimation for that 250,000 declaration, that there is the possibility, by not having full disclosure, that someone of means I could simply ask Jade, Vanessa, Damien to say each of you give $50,000 and I give 100, and therefore Mikkel, who is the financer, so to speak, wouldn't have to, have her name placed in that declaration. Is there a similar concern, or am I overthinking it?
No, I think there's a very real concern there. I mean, the provision in the regulation does require that if any individual actually splinters, but gives in his own name, in other words, 50,000, 10,000 splinters to come below the threshold, once the aggregate amounts to 250,000, it must be reported. But in the circumstances where that individual gives to other persons to donate, and he's really the provider, that remains a big loophole as to how you would catch that. There's a question to be explored, definitely.
Yes. Another loophole, Prof, is the reporting of your campaign expenses. Bear with me as my brain is not the sharpest at this moment, so I hope I'm managing to articulate myself well. But Jade, if you see me,
extremely well.
if I fall off, please help. But if reporting on campaign financing is required by both candidate and political party, but if a political party wants to overly invest in a candidate, then to my mind, that candidate can simply have the political party expending on their behalf, and therefore you don't have an idea of what expenses candidate A versus B would have fully assumed, and therefore you perhaps don't know the level of influence and who really drove candidate A or B to be an active candidate in our representational politics. And I just found it as a loophole to my mind. I'm not sure if there's any concern from where you sit, Prof, with how we report on campaign expenses, candidates versus political parties.
Yes, there is a concern there, but to the extent that the law and regulation requires a company or individual who is spending, incurring expenditure, which is related to support for a particular candidate or party, that company or individual would have to declare. So it may not come under the declaration of the individual candidate as such, but the fact that the money or the benefit, the loan, for example, is in relation to support for a candidate or party in relation to the election, that company would be required to report. Otherwise, I believe they would be in breach.
Yes. Okay.
So there is that particular element. I think it perhaps needs to be clarified more, but it exists as far as I understand it.
Yes, because sometimes there are some questions as to what is behind candidate A versus candidate B, and who is driving this particular candidate. And again, the type of influence that people exert is something I'm particularly keen on as a citizen. Another major gap, Prof, the timelines for which the reporting and the declarations and so on, becomes a requirement. Because if we look at when local government elections are sometimes called, and that close time, that follows with a general election, so to speak, I don't recall, Prof, that you must declare funds that you receive for local government or by elections for that matter. And to my mind, that is a huge gap, because if we focus on general election, and that is when you must declare, then if I don't want to have my funds declared and so on, then I just receive all I can during the local government election period. I'm not sure if I'm correct there, and if you could clarify.
Well, there are two things here. One is that, a huge gap that could drive a tractor through it is the whole issue of the reporting period and the campaign period, in the sense that if a Prime Minister wants to call a snap election before the 64 months, that's 4.5 years since the government was sworn in, then the reporting requirements would only cover the period of notice given by the Prime Minister, which will be 2 weeks or 3 weeks, of the case maybe, and would leave out all the contributions which, if he was so minded, or she was so minded, and was anticipating that an early election might be called, then what that party leader will be doing is receiving all the donations and contributions prior to the 54-month requirement and prior to the actual declaration of the election. So that is a really huge gap that needs to be covered. And one way is to do what happens in other countries where the donations to political parties are actually published on a regular basis. I think in the UK every quarter you see how many, who donated how much to which party. So that would be the point covering it. Now, in respect to the municipal election, that's a point that I would also need some clarification on, because I do believe that in the law regulation somewhere, I saw the need for reporting in respect of municipal elections. But that I would want to double check before swearing on it, because if it doesn't require any reporting in relation to municipal elections, then it, of course, is a huge loophole that needs to be covered. The law should be extended to cover municipal elections as well.
Yes, we'll find out from ECJ, because my recollection is that it doesn't, but I wanted your guidance on it. But if you're not able to, as you're saying, Prof, I think we should find out from ECJ for clarity there, because it would be concerning.
There.
Yes.
Very much so.
Is it the case for by-elections though, Prof?
Not as far as I'm aware. The candidate needs to declare, but I'm not sure how that applies to the parties for by-elections.
Okay. Hi, Jade.
Thank you for that, Prof. I think now we will hear from Dr. Barnett, and then we will comment on.
Well, and Dr. Barnett is 10 minutes, so Prof, we don't want to keep her for that entire time. So I'm not sure if there is any last comment you want to make on this particular topic before we let you go.
Just that for the forthcoming election, I would think it unrealistic that we're going to get any significant amendments to the existing legislation. But what I think is possible and necessary is for the Electoral Commission of Jamaica to develop memoranda of understanding with the bodies that are responsible for policing suspect or tainted money, to ensure that the ECJ is aware of either evidence or information that would allow them to ensure that they make certain that tainted money doesn't get into the electoral process one way or the other. So that would be my recommendation, given the short time frame between now and the election itself. And thank you very much for having me. I appreciate the conversation, and it allows me to double-check some of the questions that you have raised, Michaela.
Thank you so much, Professor Monroe. And if you get the clarifications before we end at 2, please WhatsApp and I will read it out for the listeners.
I'll certainly do that.
Thank you. Have a good day.
You too.
So that was Professor Trevor Monroe, and we're now going to listen to a recording from Dr. Lloyd Barnett, constitutional scholar.
Yes, indeed. Hi, good morning, Dr. Barnett.
Good morning.
Thank you for joining us. We wanted to get your perspective on campaign financing. We're about to go into an election period now, and we have had some calls for reforms in our campaign financing legislation. Could you just explain for the listeners what are some of the gaps in that legislation, and what are some of the areas that we need to see that reform?
Okay, the electoral system is critical to our democratic process. And as you recall, in the 1970s, it was threatened by violence, intimidation, as well as corruption, administrative weaknesses. A lot of those problems were solved by the establishment of the Electoral Commission. and citizens' participation through organizations like CAFE. But the one problem of corruption has not been solved. In 2014 to 2016, substantial progress was made by provisions for registration of political parties and the reporting of contributions to political parties. But there are a number of very serious deficiencies in the legislation. For instance, the reporting requirements are weak because not only do they relate to particular sums of money, but to a particular time. And if one is bribing an official or a minister, it need not wait until election time, 2 years before the election, to do that. So that some of the time limits are not really effective. And the second problem in relation to the prescriptions is that it relates to sums of money, which in the Jamaican context doesn't make a real limitation on the scope for bribery. For instance, there are provisions which relate to the reporting of financial contributions, which do not apply to contributions of a value of under 500,000 Jamaican dollars. And there is also, in respect of candidates, contributions of less than $250,000 are exempted from the reporting requirements. This is not really a realistic figure in the Jamaican context.
Thank you for that.
So I think that the need to have realistic sums, the need to ensure that all relevant periods are taken into account, because if one is seeking to prevent bribery, for instance, in respect of the award of contracts, then that can be done 2 years before the elections.
Yes.
It's not realistic to believe in relation to large sums of money and big contracts that a 2-year period is really effective. So there are some basic problems.
I know that in some other jurisdictions, the contributors and the donors, they are public knowledge, the persons who did donate, or the companies. Is that level of transparency here? Is that something we need?
No, because although it provides for reporting of those sums which fall within the prescription of the Act, that need not be published. The reporting requirements are to the Commission and not to the public. And there should be a requirement, as you say, for publication in order to keep up to the high standards.
Thank you. So, in summarizing these challenges, the amounts that the threshold is at, I know the period of time is something, the time frame for reporting, the 180 days to submit the report. What are your recommendations for us to improve the process?
I think the fact of the matter is, from a practical point of view, is that any contribution at all should be reported. And the time limits are not practical, because you can, if you're establishing a business or you're looking forward to a contract, that is not a time that is really restrictive. You will do it because you know that 2 or 3 years' time, you want a big contract of millions of dollars. So that I think that's one of the first things that need to be dealt with. And then there is the question of donations, which, for instance, the political parties are allowed to spend up to some 6 million or more without the need to set up any particular reporting requirements in respect of that. And a candidate can receive gifts and contributions up to a certain amount, which in the context of the Jamaican economy should not be used as a test. So that I would think that those figures and those periods for reporting needs to be revised.
Are there any best practices in terms of the time limits, in terms of the sums, or is this something that we will need to go back to consult?
I don't think time limits are relevant because, as I was trying to indicate before, a person will make an investment on the basis that it will yield substantial rewards in millions of dollars in due course. And many investments do not expect rewards or returns in a very short period, so that to put periods like 1 year and 2 years for the reporting requirements or for the reduction or the limitation of amounts, that's not effective in order to prevent corruption. So that both the time limits, the reporting periods, and the money standards need to be revised.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Barnett. Is there anything else you'd want to share with our listeners before I let you go?
Yeah, I think it is important now that we are virtually in an election period that all persons, parties, and candidates should be required to observe at least the principles of the law, even as it stands now, because the way in which the law is framed, although the political parties are governed by a 6 months period before the election date, and in this case, the election date, the ultimate date for the election is known only because we are in the last year of the parliamentary life. But in relation to candidates, it's not clear when their reporting period begins. So that I think the Commission should encourage all candidates to treat the period as beginning now, so that we can feel confident that even for this limited period, that the principles of the Act are being complied with.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Dr. Barnett. So that was Dr. Lloyd Barnett, attorney at law, giving us his some of his points on our campaign financing legislation and where we still need to reform. So we'll take the break, and when we come back, we'll close the show.
Come taste the beat with Tasty Cheese. This Easter, we're back bigger and better. The Tasty team will be at St. William Grant Park in downtown Kingston, Saturday, March 8th from 12 p.m. to 5 p.m. Save the date and don't be late. Come vibe to some tasty beats. You could win prizes and surprises. Special sale on Dairy Industries products. Other food and drink will also be on sale.
Tasty beats with tasty cheese.
Welcome back to Let's Talk Justice. So very good interview conducted by Jade with Dr. Barnett. And we earlier had Professor Trevor Monroe. And, we hear a couple gaps that we need to fix those particular loopholes. For example, spending limits. There is no clear procedure or requirements where spending limits are concerned. So we know that the disclosure or the declaration to receive funds, but the spending limits is an area that needs some gap to be plugged there. We need to double check on some other things. For example, local government, my understanding is that the requirements are not the same. We can double check on that. The area of foreign contribution is also another area we need to check on. Another matter, J2, one of them, a colleague just sent me a WhatsApp. Two things: independent expenditure. So, for example, an individual who is not directly associated with the campaign of a candidate or political party, not officially so, but they're expending in support of. You want to win the general election, so I'm paying for some ads on your behalf. How do you address some of these gaps in our campaign financing laws? Because somebody has a vested interest for you to be nominated, and you may clearly know about it, but you're not an official member of my campaign team. How do you address those issues of independent expenditures? One issue that a colleague just WhatsApped to me: how do you manage the matter of foundations that are associated with political members and candidates? And I think that's a bigger issue. When you have foundations that are named in a political leader, how that is managed, the reporting requirements, because we know that you have registration, reporting requirements with the Department of Corporate and Friendly Societies and so on. But should there be greater scrutiny when a foundation is in the name of a political leader? Because how do you ensure that there is nothing untoward that is happening in that respect? So there are several areas I think we need to talk about as we talk about good governance and accountability, and areas for electoral reform, campaign financing reform in our country. And I agree with Professor Monroe with this recommendation. The need for the ECJ to be doing ongoing monitoring and greater levels of enforcement, that comprehensive memorandum of understanding with other state agencies like your MOCA, your Integrity Commission, because more often than not what you find is that the whole ecosystem has to be working for us to again enhance our accountability system, because one institution may know information that is important for another to know that will have implications based on their respective mandates and so on. So yeah, all year round, no limitation. But what do you make of the arguments, Jade, that, very quickly, I want your view here as an attorney, privacy rights?
The argument is that disclosure, that privacy rights should trump disclosure?
Yes. So you have the 250 threshold right there. Anything above that. But, I have my little $50,000 and I want to say, you know what, let me give my $50,000 to a preferred candidate. And let me use my example. Michael Jackson, Executive Director of Jamaica for Justice, wants to give $50,000 to both the JLP and the PNP. But I don't like the idea that you want to open for everybody to know that I gave $50,000. What would you use to trump my argument about the right to privacy?
Well, I think every time we have a discussion about the right to privacy, we have to balance that with what we know to be the need for public information and for public good. If we're really looking at something as important to our governance structure as our elections and something like donations, which have had a role previously, and I mean generally have had a role in corruption in terms of how things happen in politics once it is that you have made these contributions. So I think a person who is what should I say, who is making this donation in good faith should not be concerned about their privacy, because all this declaration would show is that you as an individual gave this sum.
And you
money.
weigh the odds.
Right.
Because I think some people, based on their position, you want to ensure that they are acting in a way that is independent, has no partisan leaning. And for me, it's weighing the odd. Right to privacy, yes, but public interest, because every $50,000-$100,000 that can potentially come from a scammer, a drug dealer, somebody who import them illegal firearms and so on in the country. For me, that outweighs the privacy concerns clearly. So I hear the arguments, but I think public interest is more important in this respect than worrying about whether or not you want your $50,000 or $100,000 to be public. I think public interest outweighs those concerns.
I think it's also, in terms of democracies, it's a best practice. And looking at our history in terms of the influence of untoward actors on political parties and political motivations, we can see where the balance definitely has to be on the side of transparency, especially in our case.
But I always find it interesting, as a firm believer of human rights, I always find it interesting that we're willing to assert it when it comes to matters that will undermine governance. So lock them up, scrape them up. Don't mind that you have due process rights in that respect when we want to deal with high crime rate. But the moment it comes to holding political leaders accountable, oh my God, privacy rights concerns are to the fore. Food for thought as we talk about electoral reforms in our country. My voice is much better. Thank you for the water. I really appreciate it.
So before we close, we did not get a winner for a trivia question. Should I give them
Where's
the
this
answer?
commentator today?
Should I give them the answer, or should I give them some time to respond on our Instagram?
You can give the answer, I think.
All right. So the question
people
was,
in the hard question them.
The question easy. People must be informed.
Really?
The question was, when did the Representation of the People Amendment Act come into force? It was a 2016 act, meaning the act was passed in 2016, but it came into force in 2018. So unfortunately, no one got the answer correct. But you will all have a chance next week when we will be back with new trivia questions and a new topic.
And something easier.
Well, I don't know about that. We will always bring the challenge, but we will have something.
And you can let us know on our social media platforms what electoral reform topics you would like to know more about. Fixed election date, fixed term, etc. Yeah?
Yeah. All right. So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Jade Williams, Policy Research and Advocacy Manager at Jamaicans for Justice.
And I'm Michael Jackson, Executive Director. Have a great day.
Jamaicans for justice, the people's champion. Justice, justice for all. Justice under the law. Justice, Jamaica demand. Right to life, right to liberty. Out of many we are one in a Jamaica. Make it a better place for the boys and girls. Created equal by the creator. For equal rights and opportunities. No to unlawful detention and police brutalization. Class, gender, race or religion. We not tolerate discrimination.
To join the fight against injustice, contact us at 755-4524 or Jamaicans4Justice.org.
The people's champion.
For generations, Jamaican families have trusted Imperial Optical to keep their vision clear and their style sharp. From their first eye exam to the latest in fashion frames, we've been there for every milestone, every moment, and every memory. Whether it's your child's first day at school or your grandparents' golden years, our care spans every age, every stage. Visit Imperial Optical today. Generations of care, generations of trust.
Tune in to Cliff Views Online from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. as we broadcast live from the Water Means Food World Water Day Forum and Training Session at Ebony Park Heart Academy, Osborne Store, Clarendon on Thursday, March 20. Join us for exciting displays, exhibitions from agricultural agencies, on-the-spot prizes and giveaways. Plus, get practical training on water use efficiency for your farm. Don't miss out. Come learn, connect, and celebrate World Water Day. So tune in to Cliff Views Online from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. It's the Water Means Food World Water Day Forum and Training Session at Ebony Park Heart Academy.